In last week's sermon, we looked at the unconditional promises given by God to Abraham as a result of his faithfulness, displayed in Genesis chapter 22. And we looked at the fact that those promises are not only spiritual, that a descendant of Abraham was going to be the seed through whom everybody on the face of the earth would have the opportunity to be a part of the family of God. And we also looked at the fact that God gave Abraham certain physical promises. Those promises were passed down from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, and then to Jacob's sons. And the promises that were given in regard to the birthright, which is what we're primarily focused on now, the physical blessings and promises, were distributed to Jacob's sons. And we know that Judah received what's called the scepter promise, that there would be a king that would come through his line on down to the very time of Jesus Christ. In fact, one of those kings will be on the throne somewhere here on earth at the time of Christ's return. We also saw that the birthright promises were given to Ephraim and Manasseh, that Jacob pronounced his blessing upon them, passed on his name, Israel, to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And what we're going to do in the sermon today is examine some important points in history, the history of Israel, and look at Israel's fate after their conquest by the Assyrians. What happened to them after that point in time? And we're not going to cover every detail, but we are going to seek to get an overview of how God worked out the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham and his descendants. So we'll take a look at that today. Now, we're going to begin with something that took place in Israel. As Israel came out of the land of Egypt, they had a king. Their king was Israel, and God was to be their king from that point forward. He was their king through the time of the judges and on down to the time of the judge Samuel. And by that time, the people of Israel said, you know what? You're fine, Samuel, but your sons are actually substandard. We don't want them ruling over us. We want a king. We want a king. And the reason they wanted a king is, we'll discuss here a little further, but they wanted a king, and Israel itself was a combined church and state entity. They had religious and laws that governed them, and they also had a civil government which oversaw the nation itself. As I said, for several generations after they came out of Egypt, God was their king. But as I said, at a point in time, they said, we don't want to rely on God anymore. Because what would happen is, during the time of the judges, God was their king, and a judge would be raised up by God when there was a need. And the judge wasn't a king. What he was in a sense a viceroy, a vice king, who oversaw the particular area where he had jurisdiction and influence. And God would raise him up. Nobody said, well, hey, I'm applying for the job of being a judge. No, God would say, okay, I see you're... Usually the reason a judge was raised up is because they were being oppressed by the people around them. They would follow a sinful path, and God would allow them to go be enslaved or overrun or oppressed in some way, and they would cry out to God and repent, and God would raise up a judge who would deliver them. And this cycle went on for a time, and eventually they said, you know what? We always have to wait on God to raise up somebody to save us. What we want is a king like the other nations who's always there, and if we need judgment or we need to be saved, that king will be there, and there will be a dynasty established, and we will always have somebody we can rely on. And that's where it all fell apart in their reliance upon God, because what they were looking to is a king. A king to judge them, a king to lead them, and they were looking to that physical person as opposed to God. That's why they weren't rejecting Samuel. What they were rejecting was God being their king. And leaving it to God to make the decisions of what they needed and when to intervene in their best interest. And what they failed to realize was, you know what? If we would worship God and honor God and place him first, we would never have to worry about a king or a judge, because God would protect us and God would make sure that we were never oppressed. God would not allow it to come, or if it did come and he allowed it to test us, then he would raise a judge up or whatever we needed in order to deal with the situation. So what we find here is that the people of Israel became, as I said, dissatisfied with the judges, and they raised up, asked for a king. And their first king was Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was a Benjamite, which is interesting because who received the scepter promise? It wasn't Benjamin, but God raised up Saul to be their king. So let's say that Saul had been righteous, which he wasn't, but let's say he was righteous. Would God have fulfilled his promise? Somehow, some way, God would have fulfilled it, and it would have met the prophetic statement clearly and completely. But Saul looked like a king. He was big, he was strong, he was impressive from a physical point of view, but he lacked the character of a king. And Saul's problem was not pride. Saul's problem was a lack of self-esteem. And he constantly felt threatened. He felt threatened by David. He felt like he was overshadowed by David, and he was always in fear. And as a result of that, he failed as king. And so God eventually said, "You have overstepped the bounds one too many times, and I am going to give your kingdom to somebody else." And he had Samuel anoint David even before Saul was done with being king. With the death of Saul, the nation became a divided kingdom. As you look at Saul, Saul was the only ruler of a united Israel. He was the only ruler that Israel ever had over the entire nation. David was not a ruler over the entire nation, neither was Solomon. And you'll understand when I finish here. So with the death of Saul, the nation became a divided kingdom, and David ruled over Judah, and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, ruled over Israel. And let's take a look at this subject of the divided kingdom. And the reason that we're looking at this is because most people, when they look at the Jews, say they are Israel, when in fact they are not. And you can see this clearly in the Scriptures if you step back and look at what it has to tell you. So we're going to look at that here for a few minutes and see this divided kingdom situation. And what we see is a divided kingdom. One part of that divided kingdom carried the title Israel. And we begin to look at this in 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, it talks about the situation after the death of Solomon. And Solomon is dead, and his son Rehoboam is going to be the king of the nation of Israel. And so the leaders of the people came up to a place called Shechem. They came to Shechem, and they went there and Rehoboam came up there and was hoping to be crowned king. And let's look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1. It says here, "And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king." Now it says all Israel. All Israel. So what does that mean? Does all Israel mean what you think it means? All 13 tribes of Israel, is that what that means? Most people think that's what it means. But as you look at this, there's a complaint made when they come up to Shechem. The complaint is that Solomon's rule had been heavy upon the people. And they're asking Rehoboam, "What's your policy going to be?" And Rehoboam, being the fool that he was, asked the older men, and they said, "Listen, you need to listen to them and lighten the burden." However, the younger men said, "Don't listen to those old fools. You need to make their lives harder." And he told them that very thing. And what was the response? Let's go down to chapter 12, verse 19. Chapter 12, verse 19. It says, "So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day." So the same people that had come to Rehoboam to ask for relief from the oppressiveness of the rule of, like the rule of Solomon, they're the ones who rebelled against Rehoboam that day. And let's notice the rallying cry that they had here in verse 16. It says, "Now when all Israel," again, there's that term, all Israel, "saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, 'What share have we in David? What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David.'" We have no part in you, David, and your kingdom. We have nothing to do with you. You see to yourself. And they said, so Israel departed to their tents. Israel departed to their tents. And so who is this Israel that departed to their tents? Is it the same tribe to which David belonged? The very next verse gives us the answer in verse 17. "But Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwell in the cities of Judah." So who did Rehoboam reign over? He reigned over Judah. Now, are the people of Judah Israelites? Yes, they are. But not all Israelites, are Jews. So you have a separate kingdom. So they reigned over Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. So this Israel that rebelled against the house of David in verse 19 is not Judah. The tribes that rebelled were the northern tribes. Verse 20 here says, "Now it came to pass when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. There was none who followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only." So Jeroboam had been anointed to be a king. And God was going to give him a kingdom. And remember, they tore the garment of the prophet, and he got 10 pieces of that. And the other pieces were left to David's posterity. So as you look at this, all Israel means the northern tribes, not all the tribes. It's the second use of all Israel, and it relates to Jeroboam being king. So this reference is including Judah doesn't make any sense. It does not include Judah. It's just talking about the northern tribes. Verse 21, "And when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom to Rehoboam the son of Solomon." So we see here that Rehoboam is ruling over Judah. That's David's tribe. He's ruling over that tribe and Benjamin. And there were geographical reasons for which Benjamin ultimately went along with Judah. And eventually, as a result of what Jeroboam does, we find the Levites migrating southward and carrying out their responsibilities at the temple and living in the land of Judah. So we're stuck here with something strange as you look at this. When a group of people decides to secede, which they did, they usually don't take the name of the kingdom, which is Israel. Okay? When you had the Confederate States secede from the United States, what did they become? They became the Confederate States of America, as opposed to the United States. You also, when you had in Nigeria, they had an uprising and a group of people left, and they chose a new name. They didn't say we're Nigerians, they said we're Biafrans, and our country is Biafra. And that's usually how it goes. East Pakistan, when they said we're separating from West Pakistan, they chose a new name called Bangladesh. So it's the common pattern. They take on a new name, but with what takes place with the northern tribes, they take the name Israel. Why would they do that? Any justification for that? Well, there are two reasons why it made sense that they would be called Israel. The reason is because the two leading tribes that were involved with the northern kingdom were Ephraim and Manasseh. And it was upon Ephraim and Manasseh that Israel's name was placed. And that name was associated with them throughout the history of ancient Israel. There's also a practical reason why they took the name Israel. The situation when Saul died, he was king of Israel. He was the only king, as I said, to rule over all of the tribes of Israel. And after his death, the kingdom split into two kingdoms. After his death, the kingdom split into two kingdoms, a kingdom of Israel in the north under Saul's son Ishbosheth, and a kingdom of Judah to the south under the rule of David. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 2 and look at verse 4. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 4. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul." So what we see here is Saul has died, and Judah says, you know what? We're not going to follow Saul's son. We're going to follow David, who is of our flesh. And we think that he is going to be more successful. God has blessed him. We think he's going to be more successful. We're not following the house of Saul. So Judah made David their king, and the northern tribes, including Benjamin at that time, made Ishbosheth their king. So they anointed David, and let's go down to verse 8, 2 Samuel 2, verse 8. It says, "But Abner the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king." He was made king over all Israel. And again, we see this terminology, all Israel. And you can, if you look at the scriptures, you can see this division taking place, and you see these two different kingdoms evolving. So it's not surprising that the northern tribes would take the name Israel. Chapter 3, verse 1 of 2 Samuel, chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker." And ultimately, a couple of the commanders of Ishbosheth's army saw the handwriting on the wall, and they killed Ishbosheth. They thought that they would curry favor with David, and they came up and said, "Hey, we've killed him. You can now be king over Israel and Judah." And they didn't realize the character of David, and David didn't just say, "Hey, thanks for doing that." He killed both of them and mourned the death of Saul's son. As you go down to chapter 5, verse 1 of 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 5, verse 1, it says, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh." So all the tribes of Israel. Now, is this Judah coming up? No, it's the northern tribes that are coming up. And now they realize we don't have a king. We want David to be our king now. And so they want him to be their king. And when it's talking about all the tribes of Israel, it's not talking about Judah's not included in that. Verse 2 says, "And in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, You shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel." So they anointed David king, and he became king over Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And you have two kingdoms. He was king over two separate entities. And you can see this in chapter 5, verse 5. It says, "In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months." So he reigned over Judah alone for 7 years and 6 months. "And in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah." And it's talking about two entities there. He says he reigned over Israel and he reigned over Judah. So he was the king, and God. And as you go down to Solomon's time, let's go there where David is passing the throne on to him. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 1. 1 Kings chapter 1, and look at what it says about Solomon, who followed his father on the throne. And let's begin in verse 32. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 32. It says, so the Lord, well, let's get to chapter 1, verse 32. It says, and King David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. So they came before him. The king also said to them, take with you the servants of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule, and take him down to Gihon. There was a spring there. There let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel, and blow the horn, and say, long live King Solomon. Then you shall come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne, and he shall be king in my place. For I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and Judah. Solomon ruled over the two kingdoms. And he was their king, but they were two separate administrations in the way that he oversaw them. So we see here two kingdoms, Judah and Israel. And we can see why the northern tribes walked out of this dual kingdom, set up, and as they walked out, they set up their own kingdom known as Israel. Because the name Israel was associated with Ephraim and Manasseh, who was part of the 10 northern tribes. And it's part of what's going to be worked out prophetically. And we'll see more about that as we look at this. So Israel and Judah are separate. They're two separate kingdoms. And they've been two separate kingdoms from back in David's time all the way to the present, and they are still two separate kingdoms. The Jews, part of the Jews inhabit the land of Israel, and the rest of them are scattered. Okay, the rest of them are scattered. But the 10 tribes still exist in our time, and they're not Jews. They are Israelites, descendants of the 10 tribes. And we're especially focused here on the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. So we see here that they began to separate and they began to go their own way. And basically they had each of the divisions had their own king. Judah had their kings, Israel had their kings, beginning with Jeroboam. So we see here that the first king of Israel, the northern tribes, began to lead them in the wrong direction. We know that Jeroboam set up the 2 golden calves because he feared if he allowed the people to go up to the feast in Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, that they would say, hey, they would long to be one kingdom again. And he, as is common to human nature, was very worried about his own power, his own dynasty, and so he was unwilling to allow his people to go up to Jerusalem to worship God. So basically he said, we can do it a different way. We're still worshiping God. You know, and this calf that is in the southern part of the kingdom, this is your God. In the northern kingdom in Dan, this is your God. These are your gods. You don't need to go up to the feast. And in fact, we're going to make it easy for you. We're going to switch the feast from the 7th month to the 8th. So he set up his own worship and began to lead the people astray. And he also set up his own priest, people who would have an allegiance to him. So he set up his own priesthood. And at that point, the Levites said, you know what? We have nothing in Israel, so we'll go up to Jerusalem and Judah and live there where we can serve God. And they went up, and that's how you have Benjamin and Levi and Judah coming together as a kingdom. And you have the other 10 tribes that are to the north and had their first king as Jeroboam. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 14. 1 Kings chapter 14. So Israel moved away from God, and they continued to move away from God. And they began to, they adopted idolatry, they broke the Sabbath, which is recounted in various places in the Scriptures, most clearly in Ezekiel chapter 20. But let's look at 1 Kings chapter 14. 1 Kings chapter 14. Let's begin in verse 15, chapter 14, verse 15. For the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. He will uproot Israel from this good land which he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their wooden images, provoking the Lord to anger. And he will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, who sinned and who made Israel sin. So their king led them astray. Yes, he was their political ruler, but he led them astray. And sadly, the problems had begun earlier with Solomon. So God said he's going to uproot these people, not the Jews, but the northern kingdom. And so as you look at the Scriptures and you're trying to figure out what does it mean and how does it apply today, when you see terms like the house of Israel, who does that refer to? When it says all Israel, who does that refer to? Jacob. When it says Rachel, Ephraim, house of Joseph, these are all terms that are used by the prophets. And if you don't know who that is, then you're not going to be able to figure out who it's talking about and be able to put it all together. So understanding who Israel is crucial to your understanding of how prophecy at the end of the age is going to work out. So let's go to chapter 17, verse 18. So Israel, the prophets had come to the nation of Israel, had gone to them and sought to get them to repent, but they never did. They spoke to them over and over again, and God punished Israel, and yet they never heeded what the prophets had to say. And eventually God said, that's it. And if you look at what took place in history, the Assyrians came up and conquered them, and they put their own king, they put an Israelite king on the throne who was to have an allegiance to the Assyrians. Well, they rebelled, so they put another, they came down and they were a little harsher, and they put another king on the throne and they rebelled again. Third time, that was it. The Assyrians said, it's over for you, we're going to destroy your kingdom, and you're moving out of your kingdom where you won't be a thorn in our side any longer. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18. It says here, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah. So what God did is he removed the people of Israel from the land that they had been promised. And the people of Israel were taken north and east by the Assyrians and were living up by the southwestern portion of the Caspian Sea. That's where they were taken. And what the Assyrians did is they brought in the people that are known as the Samaritans by the time of Christ that were brought in to occupy the land. And they had some familiarity with the religion of Israel because they brought back a priest. They were suffering attacks by animals, and they said, hey, we don't know how the God of this land works, so we need to bring a priest in to give us the instructions of how to properly honor this God. So in chapter 17, verse 22, it tells us, for the children of Israel walked in the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. As he had said by all his servants the prophets, so Israel was carried away from her own land to Assyria as it is to this day. They were carried away, and in the years 721 to 718, and they were carried to the land of Assyria. And there on the shores of the Caspian Sea, they became lost from view. So where did they go? Where did they go? Does it matter? Let's think about this as you look at the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel was prospered by God. But the promises that were made to Abraham, those physical promises, were never fulfilled in ancient Israel. They were never fulfilled between the time they came into the land around 1400 BC down to 700 BC. It didn't happen. There was no nation that prospered above all the others, like Manasseh was to do, nor was there a nation who became a commonwealth of nations, as was Ephraim was supposed to do. Those blessings were to be played out, so they did not happen during the time that Israel was in the land of promise. So God never fulfilled that. So Israel's taken into captivity, and God still has promises to fulfill. So is he going to do it? Or has God said, well, it didn't work out, tough luck? You remember, God promised Abraham he would do it. And he not only promised, but he said, you know what? I swear that I will do it. I swear by my name that I will fulfill these promises. That means God's obligated to fulfill the promises. So he didn't fulfill them when they were in the land of Israel, so when did he fulfill them? Well, as I said, Israel was to lose its identity, its language, its religion, its land, and its name. So they're taken into captivity, and they lost all that. They lost a remembrance of who they were and where they were from. But the Jews, interestingly, they were taken into captivity, and they came back into the land, but they never lost sight of who they were. And there's a reason for that, because they continued to be faithful to the Sabbath. And when you keep the Sabbath, it helps you know who you are and who God is. Now, they're imperfect in many ways, but they have continued to keep the Sabbath and have had that identity that they are God's people. Israel forsook the Sabbath, and as a result, they lost sight of who they were. So what we see is Israel moves out of the land and is in captivity, and what happened to them. Let's just look at a few things here. There's a lot of historical things, and you can find various waymarks and things that are interesting about Israel, and we're not going to have anywhere near the time to look at this, but we'll look at a few of them. So in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17, Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17, it says here, "And I will wait upon the Lord that hides his face from the house of Jacob." God allowed them to go into captivity, and he hid his face from the house of Jacob. The house of Jacob, the house of Israel, the same thing. And so let's look at a few scriptures that tell us about where Israel is today. It tells us, let's go to Amos. Let's go to Amos and look at chapter 1. What we find is different bits of information in the prophets that give us some insight about Israel. And we can find some things historically. Amos chapter 1, verse 1. It says here, "The words of Amos, who was among the sheepherders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, the king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." And he speaks of a sinful kingdom. And that's who he was sent to address, the sinful kingdom. And back a little further back in the book of Amos in chapter 9, it talks about Israel and what was to take place. Amos chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. It says, "Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are on the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth, yet I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, says the Lord. So I'm going to punish them, but I'm not going to utterly destroy them. For surely I will command and will sift the house of Israel among all nations, as grain is sifted in a sieve, yet not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground." So this prophecy says Israel, not Judah, was to be sifted among the nations. Now the Israelites lost their identity, yet God protected and kept them. And he says here, "Yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth." And it was during this time of sifting that the children of Israel were to abide many days without a king. And that's a quote from Hosea chapter 3, verse 4. There was to be no Davidic king ruling over them. So these things all came to pass, and Israel was lost. But God said that eventually Israel was going to find a place that they would make their own, and they wouldn't move from that place anymore. So let's look at a few scriptures that point to where they may have been taken or where they migrated to. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 49. Isaiah chapter 49. Isaiah chapter 49, it says here, Listen to me, listen, O coastlands, to me, and take heed, you peoples from afar. The Lord has called me from the womb, from the matrix of my mother. He has made mention of my name. And so the people addressed Israel are called, O isles, in the first verse. And in verse 3, it says, And he said to me, You are my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. The term isles or island is sometimes translated coastlands. Jeremiah locates Israel in the north country and says in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 9 and 10, I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O you nations, that's referring to Ephraim and Manasseh, and declare it in the isles afar off. In Isaiah chapter 41, verses 1 and 8, it says, Keep silence before me, O islands. You, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. So there are references to Israel. God didn't forget about them. Jeremiah chapter 31. The message is declared in the isles afar off and is to be shouted in the chief of the nations. So today, as in Jeremiah's day, the house of Israel is in the isles, which are in the sea, the chief of the nations, northwest of Israel. And if you look at where Israel was, the promised land, and you look northwest of there, and you look for islands, what islands do you find? You find the British Isles to the northwest. So you may think, well, that's pretty iffy. That's really pretty iffy. But think of a few things that are interesting to consider, and we'll consider probably the most telling thing in my mind as far as why the British Isles and the United States tie into Ephraim and Manasseh. It's interesting when you look at the Hebrew meaning of names. They're called, the people living in those isles are called the British. And the house of Israel was the covenant people. Weren't they the covenant people? They were, weren't they? The Hebrew word for covenant, interestingly, is berit. B-E-R-I-Y-T-H or B-E-R-I-T-H. When you look back to the time of Gideon and you look at the worship that was going on at that time, they worshipped Baal Berit, that is the Baal of the covenant. Now the Hebrew word for man is ish. Anglicized it's ish. In English, the ending ish means of or belonging to a specified nation or person. And in the original Hebrew language, vowels were never given in spelling. You just have the consonants there. And you had to look at the context to determine exactly what the sound would be. Eventually, in time, they started putting little vowel points and all that, so knew how to pronounce it. But if you omit the vowel, as you look at this and you look at the name Brit and you look at Ish, what are they? They're the Brit-ish, the covenant men. Now, they don't have any tie-in, many of them, to ancient Israel. They don't know anything about this for the most part. There are people in Britain who do understand something about this, and unfortunately this particular idea about Britain and Israel is used as a racial, and it's used in a racist sense, and it shouldn't be, as we'll see here. The Hebrew, as you look at them, you've heard of the term anti-Semitism. If you spelled it, it would be S-H-E-M. But many people that speak Hebrew don't pronounce the H. So S-H-E-M, Shem, would be pronounced Sim. And that's the same, and that particular trait is found in English. So they're called covenant men, the people of Britain, whether they know it or not. And the house of Israel not only was to lose its identity, but its name. It was to be called by a new name. They aren't called Israelites, they're called British. And Abraham said to Isaac, God said to Abraham, "In Isaac shall your seed be called." What's another name for the people who live in England? They are Isaac's sons. You would call them Saxons. Saxons. The Eternal intended that lost Israel was to be located in the last days. And one of the tribes that was to leave a waymark or a sign of where they went, where you could follow them, was the tribe of Dan. When you looked at Dan, when they were given allotments in the land of Israel, after they came into the land and they had the conquest, part of the people of Dan lived on the coast. It says prophetically that Dan would dwell in ships. It also said that he would be like a serpent's tail by the trail. It could also be you would leave a trail that you could follow. And so when Israel was falling, part of the people of Dan left in ships. And it appears they went to Ireland. A portion of them went to Ireland. But the other portion was captured and taken northward to the area of the Caspian Sea. And so as you begin to look at the map and you begin to look at the names of different things, you find, interestingly, that you have rivers in Europe that, like the Dnieper, you have a number of different rivers that are related to Dan. The Dniester, and you find different cities that relate to Dan. Dan liked using their name, and wherever they went, they used it. As you move further west, you have a place called Danzig. You have a country called Denmark. When you get into the land of Scotland, you have all the, you have the Loch Ness Monster, and you have these different Dun and Dan names. And the same thing you find in Ireland. Now, why is that? So you can find some record of Israel migrating to the west. They migrated to the west, and you have different rivers and different cities with these names that relate to the people of Israel. Now, what's most interesting and one of the most telling things that you find here is relates to a number. And that number is 2,520. 2,520. Now, during the time that Israel occupied the land of promise, Ephraim never became, as I said, a powerful, wealthy company of nations, nor did Manasseh become a wealthy nation. And the promises were never fulfilled in that time because Israel did not live up to what was required of them and explained to them in the time of Moses in Leviticus chapter 26. They didn't live up to it. And as a result of that, they were carried away into captivity, and those promises were not able to be fulfilled. And so let's go to Leviticus chapter 26. You might ask, well, why did God wait so long to fulfill his promises? He did give them the land of promise, as he had said, but he didn't fulfill them fully. Let's go to Leviticus 26. So Leviticus 26 was a warning to the people of Israel, in Moses' time and throughout the time that they dwelled in the land, and it's a prophecy that applies to all of us today. Let's look at Leviticus 26. And it's interesting what we're told here as you look at Leviticus 26. In chapter 26, verse 1, it begins by saying, "You shall not make idols for yourselves." Wasn't that one of the primary problems with Israel? The first king that they had of their nation, what did he do? He introduced idolatry, and they went right for it. And God right here says, don't do that. "Neither a carved image nor a sacred pillar shall you rear up for yourselves, Nor shall you set up an engraved stone in your land and to bow down to it. You're not to do that. You're not to be involved in idolatry. And then what did God say next? He said, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. These are both test commandments. Will you become involved in idolatry? Will you keep my Sabbaths? And sadly, Israel didn't keep either one of those commandments. They failed those tests miserably. And so God gave them these test commandments. They were tests of obedience. They're tests of obedience for the people then and now. So they were involved in idolatry and breaking the Sabbath. Verse 3, it says, "For if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and perform them." So there are conditions to them receiving the blessings. If you do these things, there will be blessings, and if not, there will be cursings. He says, "Then I will give you rain in its season." What a wonderful blessing that is, to have rain in its season, because it comes at the right time and helps your crops to grow. He says, "The land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit." That's what God said He would do for you. He would give you the rain in its season, and you would have abundant crops. He says in verse 5, "Your threshing shall last till the time of vintage." When you bring in the harvest, it's going to last until the time when you're getting ready to plant again. The vintage shall last till the time of sowing. You're going to have such abundance, it's not going to run out. You're going to have plenty. All the way up to the time you begin to sow, you're going to have plenty. He says, "You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land." To have plenty of food and to dwell safely in your land. He says, "And I will give peace in the land." What a great blessing that is, to not worry about people invading you, not worry about external threats, to be able to go to sleep at night in your home and feel safe. You know, the old days when you could leave your car unlocked, you didn't have security systems and all of the things that we have to have today. He said, "That will be a blessing. You have peace in your land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. I will rid the land of evil beast." That means no mosquitoes, no snakes, none of those terrible things. But anyway, those are just things I would get rid of. But anyway, "I will rid the land of evil beast, and the sword will not go through your land." You're not going to have the sword go through the land. You're not going to have people invade you. If you're obedient, you will be blessed in this way. He says, "You will chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you." I'm going to bless you, protect you, and if you have to go to war and deal with your enemies, you're going to be victorious. You may have a small army, as was mentioned, Gideon, but you will be victorious because I will be with you, and I will help you to be successful. So the promises that God gave were conditional upon them being obedient, and they weren't obedient. And as a result of that, they were removed from the land. Let's go to begin in verse 9 here. It says, "For I will look on you favorably and make you fruitful and multiply you and confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat the old harvest and clear out the old because of the new." And so God's going to dwell among them and going to bless them in every way. But if they won't obey, verse 14, "But if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, and you despise my statutes, or if your soul abhors my judgments, so that you do not perform all my commandments, but break my covenant, I also will do this to you. I will even appoint terror over you, wasting disease, and fever which shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you, and you shall be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when no one pursues you." Instead of being able to defeat your enemies and God is with you, your enemies, you're going to be running from your enemies even when no one is there. Verse 8, and then he gets into the crux of the matter. He says, after all this, if you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to punish you 7 times more. Do we see an example of that in the Scriptures where Israel was punished for a period of time because of their sin? Remember when Israel came out of Egypt and they came up to the land of promise, and God told them they sent out spies to check out the land, and then the spies came back, and God wanted them to go up and take the land at that point. So the spies came back. They had this rod with this huge bunch of grapes on there, impressive, and 2 of the spies said, we can win this. Let's go up and take the land. God is with us. And the other spy said, not going to happen. They've got huge cities, huge, massive walls. They've got giants in the land. We can never conquer these people. So everybody in Egypt began to, cry and moan and reject Moses. Let's appoint new leaders and go back to Egypt. And Caleb and Joshua said, no, hey, we can do it. But they angered God. And God said, okay, have it your way. I'm not going to allow you to go up to the land. So they weren't allowed to go up to the land. And God said, I'm going to punish you 1 year for every day that the spies were in the land. A day for a year. So I'm going to allow you to suffer for 40 years. And they suffered for 40 years in the wilderness before they went into the land of promise. And those youngsters that you said were all going to die out here in the wilderness, they're the ones that are going to inherit the land. So it says here, and if you will not yet for all this hearken to me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. And this expression 7 times is translated into English from a Hebrew word which conveys a dual meaning. It could either mean length of time or it can mean intensity. For instance, that particular word was used in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm going to make this furnace 7 times hotter. And that same word was used there. But it can also refer to prophetic times. In prophecy, a time is a prophetic 360-day year. And during Israel's punishment, each day represented a year being fulfilled. So when it says in Leviticus 26, verse 18, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins, it's evident both by the wording in the sentence and by the fact of actual fulfillment that is speaking of duration, speaking of 7 prophetic times or years. And on this year for a day principle, it becomes 7 360-day years, a total of 2,520 days, or 2,520 years, that they would be punished. So they fell in 712, 718 BC. So if you go forward in time, 2,520 years, what happens? What do you see happening at that particular point? You come to a time where God said, I'm going to fulfill my promises. I'm not going to fulfill my promises because the people that I'm going to fulfill my promises to are a righteous, deserving people, because the people of Britain weren't. They weren't. They were God's people in a sense, and God had made a promise to their ancestor Abraham, and God said, I have to fulfill this. And so he did. And it was not because of their righteousness. So beginning around AD 1800, 1803, after 2,520 years, God caused the birthright nations to come into their birthright. And if you look at the United States existed then and Britain existed then, but neither one of them prior to 1800 were all that special. They controlled a very little territory. The United States was 13 colonies plus 2 states. And Britain wasn't that impressive. Neither one of them. But things changed on a dime once this time was up, and God began to fulfill his promises. And he began to fulfill his promises to the British, making them a commonwealth of nations, a commonwealth on which the sun never set. They controlled the seas, and they were very powerful and influential up until around World War I. In World War I, they really began their decline. And they took on World War II, standing against the armies of the German army and others. But they basically were wiped out financially at that time. And who took over after World War I? The 20th century is called the American century. And both of those nations became incredibly wealthy. And if you take the time to study this, you can see the various blessings that God gave to these descendants of ancient Israel. It's truly amazing. And at some point in Bible study, we'll probably go through that and see some of that, but we're not at this point because we don't have time. And I know all of you are looking at your watch. So anyway, we have, the thing is, you have, if you look at what God gave to Israel, it is remarkable. What he gave to Ephraim and he gave to Manasseh. And as you look at how these nations have prospered, then you can see God did fulfill his promises, and these are the descendants of Israel. It's interesting also, if you look at go back to the time of Queen Victoria, she had them go back and trace her genealogy. And if you look at Queen Victoria, they traced her genealogy back to David. So the Davidic kingship does still exist. Queen Elizabeth rules on the throne of Britain, a descendant of David. Now, interestingly, we talked about Israel rose. But the thing is, those unconditional promises that Abraham gave to Israel are not limitless. And the same principles that applied to Israel in Leviticus 26, they apply to us now. And so if God would punish Israel back then because they failed to live up to their commitment, their covenant promises, what will happen today? And what we see, and we'll talk about next time in the first Sabbath in January, is how quickly the blessings that God bestowed upon Israel are being taken away.